Dust of Time. Season 1, Episode 2, The Accountant Who Started History. Welcome back to Dust of Time. We are in Season 1, The First Cities. Last time, we stood on the ziggurat of Uruk and watched the world's first city hum like a machine. Today, that machine runs into a very modern problem, too much to remember, and solves it by accidentally inventing writing. This is the day history itself begins, and it begins with the most unlikely hero imaginable. Let's ease into it. A man sits cross-legged in a storeroom in Uruk, around 3300 BC, and he has a problem that could get him beaten. In front of him, jars. Hundreds of jars of barley, stacked to the ceiling, the raw material for the temple brewery. Barley comes in from a dozen estates, goes out to brewers, comes back as beer, goes out again as rations. Thousands of transactions a year flow through this room, and every one of them is his responsibility. If the count is offered the annual reckoning, the difference comes out of his hide. For generations, men in his position have tracked debts with small clay tokens, a cone for a measure of grain, a disc for a sheep, sealed inside hollow clay balls. It works, badly. You cannot check the tokens without smashing the ball. So somewhere along the line, clerks began pressing the tokens into the wet surface of the ball before sealing it, so the outside showed what the inside held. And then someone had the thought that changes everything, the kind of thought that seems obvious only afterward: if the marks on the outside tell you everything, why keep the tokens at all? Why keep the ball? Flatten the clay. Keep the marks. The tablet is born. The man in the storeroom takes a damp clay tablet, and with a reed stylus he presses in the signs, numbers, the symbol for barley, a span of time, and then two final marks that stand for a name. His name. Kushim. The tablet is a receipt for roughly 135,000 liters of barley received over 3 years. He signs it the way you initial a spreadsheet, and tosses it in the archive. 5,000 years later, archaeologists will pull that tablet from the ruins of Uruk and realize what they are holding. Kushim, a barley accountant, is the first human being in history whose name we know. Not a king. Not a prophet. Not a warrior. An accountant. And historians add the honest caveat: Kushim might technically be a title or an office rather than a personal name, though many scholars read it as a name. Either way, the point stands, and I find it wonderful. History does not begin with a hero. It begins with a receipt. Quick map check. We are still in Uruk, the giant city from last episode, around 3300 BC, roughly 2 centuries after the point where we opened last time. The city machine is running hot, 40,000 mouths, temple storehouses, trade routes stretching 1,000 kilometers. And that is exactly the problem. The machine now generates more obligations than any human memory can hold. Writing was not invented to record poetry, or prayers, or the deeds of kings. It was invented because the warehouse got too big. For its first 500 years, writing is almost exclusively accounting. Nobody writes down a story, a law, or a love letter. It is barley, beer, sheep, and taxes. Civilization's first literature is an audit. Now let's follow what this invention became, because the crude receipt of 3300 BC evolves, step by step, into the tool that makes history possible. The first tablets are pictographic. The sign for barley looks like a barley stalk, the sign for ox looks like an ox head. Fine for inventory, useless for ideas. How do you draw yesterday? How do you draw a name like Kushim? The breakthrough is the rebus principle, using a picture for its sound instead of its meaning, the way you might write I believe as an I, a B, and a leaf. With sounds in play, writing snaps free from pictures and can record anything a mouth can say. Meanwhile, the signs themselves get faster and more abstract. Scribes stop drawing curves, which drag in wet clay, and start pressing straight wedge-shaped strokes with a cut reed. Wedge writing. In Latin, centuries later, scholars will call it cuneiform, from cuneus, wedge. By around 2600 BC, cuneiform can record the full Sumerian language, and it will go on to be adapted for a dozen other languages over 3,000 years, longer than the alphabet you read has existed so far. Something else profound happened inside those early tablets, easy to miss. Humanity learned abstract numbers. The old tokens fused the thing and the count. 3 sheep tokens meant 3 sheep, and you could not say 3 of nothing. The early tablets kept that habit, using different number signs for counting sheep than for measuring grain. Then, slowly, the scribes pried the number loose from the thing, until 3 was just 3, a pure idea that could apply to sheep, jars, days, or stars. Mathematics as a subject, and not just counting, becomes possible at that moment. Within centuries, Mesopotamian scribes were solving what we would call quadratic equations, and compiling tables that made their base 60 arithmetic hum. But a technology is only as powerful as the people trained to use it, so Sumer invents something else, the school. They called it the Idubba, the tablet house. Sons of the well-off, and it was overwhelmingly sons, though we know of some female scribes, spent years there memorizing hundreds of signs, copying word lists, taking dictation. We know astonishing details about these schools because students wrote about them, and their homework survives. One famous school text has a boy describing his day: Cain for sloppy copying, Cain for talking, Cain for bad Sumerian. His solution is timeless. He gets his father to invite the teacher to dinner, feed him well, and hand him a gift. The teacher, warmed and fed, declares the boy the finest of students. Bribery of teachers, 5,000 years old, preserved in fired clay. And here is the thing to sit with: literacy was power, and it was scarce. Perhaps 1 person in 100 could read. The scribes were the operating system of Mesopotamian civilization, the ones who assessed the taxes, drafted the contracts, wrote the king's letters. Kings themselves were usually illiterate and had to trust what was read to them. One later king, Ashurbanipal of Assyria, will brag in writing that he, a king, could actually read, and that boast tells you how rare it was. Once writing can hold anything, everything changes, in a cascade. Contracts appear, and suddenly a promise can outlive the people who made it. Deeds record land sales. Court verdicts get filed. Letters let a merchant in one city instruct an agent in another, and let kings negotiate without meeting. And eventually, centuries after Kushim, someone does the thing the accountants never intended: they write down the stories. The myths, the hymns, the proverbs that had lived only in human mouths for uncounted generations, and finally the tale of a king of Uruk named Gilgamesh, who will be our whole next episode. Before we get to what it all means, one last story, about how we can read any of this at all, because cuneiform died. Around the 1st century AD, after more than 3,000 years of use, the last scribes who could read it were gone, and the script fell utterly silent. For 18 centuries, the tablets were mute lumps of clay, and travelers guessed the wedge marks might be decoration, or bird tracks. The key turned out to be hanging off a cliff in Iran. At Behistun, the Persian king Darius the Great, a man we will meet properly in Season 5, had carved a giant boast about his victories 100 meters up a rock face, in 3 languages side by side: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform. In the 1830s and 40s, a British Army officer named Henry Rawlinson repeatedly scaled the cliff, at times standing on a ladder balanced over the drop, once employing a local boy who swung across the rock on ropes to press wet paper against the inscription, to copy it all. Old Persian was crackable, scholars already partly knew the language, and with that as the key, the Babylonian version fell too. In 1857, 4 scholars were each sent the same unpublished inscription, and asked to translate it independently. Their versions matched. Cuneiform was officially readable again, and 500,000 surviving tablets began, slowly, to speak. Kushim had waited 5,000 years for that moment. There is one more consequence, the biggest one, and it is about you and me. Everything before writing is prehistory, a story told only by bones and broken pots, full of people who can never speak to us. Everything after writing is history, the part where the dead talk. The reason this podcast can tell you what these people bought, taught, feared, and joked about is that they pressed it into clay. And clay, unlike paper, is nearly immortal. When a Mesopotamian city burned, its libraries did not burn. They baked. Fire hardened the tablets like a kiln, and destruction became preservation. We have more original documents from ancient Iraq, hundreds of thousands of tablets, than from ancient Greece and Rome combined. What did it change? Writing is the technology all other technologies depend on. It let knowledge accumulate beyond one lifetime, let strangers cooperate through contracts, let states scale beyond one valley, and gave the dead a voice. Every book, every law, every line of code is downstream of a barley receipt. If you remember 3 things from today, make them these. First, writing was invented in Uruk around 3300 BC by accountants, from clay tokens to tablets, evolving into wedge-shaped cuneiform, and for centuries it recorded nothing but the economy. Second, the first named person in history is Kushim, a beer and barley accountant, possibly a title, probably a name, definitely not a king. Third, writing is the line between prehistory and history, and Mesopotamia's clay tablets survived fire better than paper ever could, which is why we know these people so well. Next time on Dust of Time, the scribes finally write down the stories, and the greatest of them is about a real king of Uruk, 2/3 god and 1/3 man, who fought a wild man and made him his brother, defied a goddess, watched his brother die, and walked to the end of the world to ask why we have to die at all. Gilgamesh, the first hero, is next.